is at 28% in the latest Reuters poll. Carson down to 11 points. Not too far ahead of Marco Rubio at 8%. Trump, obviously, in the Reuters national poll, ahead by a great deal. Meanwhile, a new poll of New Hampshire voters, though, matters much more. These early primary and caucus states matter much more. Shows Trump gaining support while Carson is dropping. Trump's at 23%. Carson's at 13%. Tied with Marco Rubio for second place. Ted Cruz in fourth place at 8%. Jeb Bush, John Kasich tied for fifth with 7%. It's going to be very interesting, Mark Halperin, to see how Paris and the after effect of Paris shakes that poll up moving forward. I would expect actually Jeb Bush to move up.
Those seven people that are just up there on those New Hampshire numbers, those 7 people now are fighting for the nomination, and they're fighting to show that they're ready to be commander-in-chief in January of 2017. Yep. And I think you see Trump is rated high on strength. Trump is rated high on dealing with ISIS. It's up to the establishment candidates, including Jeb Bush, who's giving a big speech today at the Citadel on his vision of national security, to say to the voters, you know what? You need somebody who understands this stuff and has done it.
I make no comparison between Donald Trump and Ronald Reagan, but we can have this conversation and you'll understand, because we can remember it. Some of the kids don't out there that are watching. But I do remember in 78, 79, 80, Ronald Reagan being called an amiable dunce, treated with about as much contempt in the national press as Donald Trump is now. Donald Trump is now, not comparing the two, but just like Ronald Reagan showed strength on the Panama Canal Treaty, which most foreign experts would say was a foolish position for Ronald Reagan to take, just as he spoke, tough on the Iranian hostage crisis, you have Donald Trump, who is the exact opposite. And he would take this as an honor, as would Obama supporters, as what Barack Obama was in that G20 press conference. If you don't like Barack Obama's leadership, then if you're in the Republican Party, this may be Donald Trump's time.
As counterintuitive as it might sound, I said this on Sunday after he had that rather remarkable sort of ranting appearance. Right. I said, at this point in time, after Paris, people may want the big man theory, the strong man theory, and that's what he projects, in contrast, many would say, critics would say, to what we're seeing from the administration. I'm not putting myself in that. I'm just saying that is the contrast of strength and force. They were celebrating in the Carter White House in the late 70s when they saw Reagan moving up, and when he got the nomination, they thought that they had dodged a bullet because Ronald Reagan could never be elected president of the United States. I have a quick question, though, for the table. What did you make of Mitt Romney's foreign policy op-ed? Was that saying, if you're looking for an alternative and if things get deadlocked, I'm still in the game?
Is he going to jump in?
All of a sudden, an op-ed from Mitt Romney on foreign policy in the Washington Post?
I don't see the logic of it at this stage. I mean, really?
It's the convention or bust. If he's in this game, it's because no one can get a majority of the delegate. But I think one reason he jumped in is he looks at the 4 establishment candidates, Christie and Rubio and Kasich and Bush, and he says our nominee must be one of those 4. And I think he wants to set an example for them.
So he's not including Cruz.
He wants to frame that argument.
He wants to frame it and give them a model to go for.
But most Republican establishment figures believe that this is going to end up at a brokered convention. If Donald Trump continues this, Ben Carson's falling off. I suspect we're going to see that fall continue.
Yeah.
And Mark Halperin and I have held the position, and I think, Mark, you still hold it now. If Donald Trump wins Iowa, there's not going to be a brokered convention.
It's not. Yeah, there's not.
It's going to be a Donald Trump coronation.
I think you're right.
And so the establishment may still be fooling itself.
Still to come, reports that intelligence officials were listening to chatter that seemed to indicate a new attack was coming. NBC News Justice correspondent Pete Williams joins us with the latest on the investigation. We'll be right back. An advisor to Ben Carson says the Republican candidate is struggling to grasp foreign policy. This after Carson doubled down this week on his assertion of Chinese military involvement in Syria.
The Syrians have sophisticated Chinese weaponry. That's the basis of it. And that sophisticated Chinese weaponry requires support in order to utilize it.
And where are you getting that information from? Who's been advising you on that matter?
My advisors. I have advisors who are former military people, and advisors who are former CIA people.
But Dwayne Claridge, an 83-year-old former CIA operative advising Dr. Carson, says it's been difficult to get through to him on foreign policy. He told the New York Times, quote, "Nobody has been able to sit down with him and have him get one iota of intelligent information about the Middle East." He also said Carson needed weekly conference calls briefing him on foreign policy so, quote, "we can make him smart." The Carson campaign pushed back, saying that Carson has daily briefings and that Claridge is, quote, "clearly not one of Dr. Carson's top advisors." For the New York Times to take advantage of an elderly gentleman and use him as their foil.
It's the Rumsfeld effect.
And my lord, in this story is an affront to good journalistic practice.
David,
But wait, there's more. Ben Carson is under under scrutiny for an evasive answer on ISIS that he gave on Fox News this weekend.
But who would you call first, specifically, to put together an international military coalition?
My point being that if we get out there and we really lead, and it appears that we're making progress, then all of the Arab states and even the non-Arab states, who I think are beginning to recognize that the jihad movement is global. It is not just local in the Middle East. But if we fight it there, they will have to pool their resources in that area, and then we won't have to necessarily fight them here. That's what I'm saying.
But can you tell us who you would call first, sir, on the international scene?
I would call for all of the Arab states to be involved in this. I would call for all of our traditional allies to be involved in this. You know, I don't want to leave anybody out.
after criticism for failing to provide a single country he would call, Carson advisor Armstrong Williams told the New York Times, quote, "He's been briefed on it so many times, I guess he just froze."
Williams elaborated in an interview with Mark Halperin.
Dr. Carson was very dismissive of the question. He did not think it was a question because it was hypothetical. And Dr. Carson doesn't like answering hypotheticals, and so he intentionally did not answer the question. And why I know that, because I had an extensive discussion with him earlier this morning about the Fox interview.
What did he say?
He said he was very dismissive. He just thought it was a silly question. And I said to him, I said, look, when you're on these national forums as well as in the debates, when they ask these questions, while you may think they're silly, if you don't answer them, people may think that you don't know the answer, in which you've been asked that question 100 times and we know you know the answer. The landscape of foreign policy, the country, and the dynamics are changing every day. The bottom line, on any given day, any of these candidates can be asked a question about foreign policy that they could not answer. Dr. Carson is still on a learning curve. There's much for him to learn. He is not perfect. He will never be perfect, but he continues to surround himself with people and engage people that can enhance his foreign policy credentials.
Mark Halperin, you were just telling me somebody on Twitter said you're putting out the fire with gasoline by saying he's still on a learning curve. The United States and our allies, not only the Western world, but also across the Middle East, are at a critical time. And we have a guy who can't name a single country that would want to be an ally. And Dewey Claridge saying that he's not absorbing this information.
Dr. Carson is not a foreign policy expert. and yet his campaign manager, Barry Bennett, told me the other day, he said, look at the whole field. There's nobody in this field who's a true foreign policy
expert. But you interviewed Jeb.
This is not a serious candidate.
He does not look serious there, especially when you compare that interview with your interview with Jeb Bush yesterday,
oh my goodness,
who handled every single question in a way, I've got to say, that actually makes him not only lap Marco Rubio, but everybody else in the field.
Jeb Bush was,
and you said as much.
He was extraordinarily impressive. We talked to him for 25 minutes or so, and he answered every question fluidly with a lot of detail and a lot of heart too, not just memorized talking points. And Dr. Carson can't do that, but he is appealing to people on a different basis than that.
But post Paris, I don't know that a guy that makes you feel good about his life story is going to be as appealing to Republican voters, is it?
think at this point, and I think the polls reflect this, the country doesn't need someone to be on a learning curve. You need to have an understanding, at least at a visceral level, of what you need to do here as President of the United States. And look, January of 2017 waits for no one. You step into that office the first day, they give you that national security briefing. You'd better be prepared to make that first phone call to your Arab allies or whoever you decide you need to speak to. But if you don't know that now, the question that the country has to ask is, can we wait for you to find out?
And by the way, new polls.
We have new poll numbers that show the American public is uneasy with the United States ISIS strategy. A New York Times CBS News poll released just before the terrorist attacks in Paris last week found that Americans were already unhappy with the president's approach to ISIS. Just 31% of Americans said they approve of the way the president is handling the situation with ISIS militants in Iraq and Syria. 72% felt things were going badly for the U.S. in its fight against ISIS. And with
these are the same folks oftentimes who suggest that they're so tough that just talking to Putin or staring down ISIL or using some additional rhetoric somehow is going to solve the problems out there. But apparently they're scared of widows and orphans coming into the United States of America as part of our tradition of compassion. Now, first they were worried about the press being too tough on them during debates. Now they're worried about 3-year-old orphans. That doesn't sound very tough to me. They've been playing on fear in order to try to score political points or to advance their campaigns. And it's irresponsible. And it's contrary to who we are. And it needs to stop because the world is watching.
That was the president last night in the Philippines. David Ignatius, I've got to go back to you. Is that an appropriate time for the president to take this time?
Watching the president go back to his earlier criticism of Republicans who couldn't handle debate moderators, that's clearly wrong. It's not appropriate in the moment, and it's hard to watch that. His point that these arguments keep out Syrians, keep out Muslims, is contrary to our traditions, I think is right. I think that we are an open country. That Statue of Liberty tells us the world that, and I think his argument that in terms of our national security, our position in the world, we need to send a different message to the world. I think that's also right, but I agree entirely that the tone he used, the political cut of it, that was wrong.
He just, he considers a lot of people out there posing right now, and it's irritating him, but sometimes,
it is irritating.
Sometimes as commander-in-chief, it's better to
just
hide
ignore
that.
the irritating.
Well,
we've been
actually,
watching
to
the
unite
news.
the country, yes.
Well, that's actually on all of us, Joe.
Yes. We have
and
one president.
I think we'll start with the governors who actually have no jurisdiction over this decision, talking about something that they have nothing to do with, really merely for political purposes. Some who are up for re-election and are using this. That's ugly, and that's really not what's called on all of us right now to come together as a country. So it's not just the president.
Let's go.
All morning long, we've been watching the news on the police raid of a terror cell near Paris, where 2 are dead and 7 are under arrest. Joining us now, member of the Foreign Relations Committee, Democratic Senator Chris Coons of Delaware, also director of the Transnational Threats Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Thomas Sanderson, and former House Majority Leader Eric Cantu, who has just endorsed Jeb Bush for president. Good to have you all on board.
Good to have you guys here. Senator, let's begin with you. What do we need to be looking for from Congress? As there's more talk about aggressive actions, possibly more boots on the ground, do we need to declare war against ISIS?
First, we have been at war against ISIS since August of last year, when we began running military actions, taking airstrikes against ISIS, first in Iraq, then in Syria. Remember the Yazidis who fled up Sinjar Mountain. The president sent an authorization for military force up to Congress in February of this year. We haven't taken it up. We haven't debated it. We haven't authorized it. We should. I think that's our constitutional responsibility. It's difficult for us to come to consensus around our policy and our strategy, but we should. Second, we need to do our homework and have a responsible bipartisan conversation about what is the refugee screening policy, what are the weaknesses or threats that we now need to assess in light of this Paris attack, And what more should we be doing to fund and support the Department of Homeland Security so it can keep us safer and so it can make sure, as the federal agency principally responsible for making sure that those who come to this country are appropriately vetted, that we've dealt with any new threats.
Thomas Anderson, how great of a threat is ISIS to the homeland?
It's pretty significant, not the same degree as it is in Europe or in France in particular, where they have thousands of people who've gone to the battlefield. But we do have hundreds of individuals here who have either tried to go or who have gone and who could come back and attack. But it's more the inspired individuals who are heeding the call of ISIS to kill them where they are or attack in place that is a real concern here.
And what do we do? Eric Cantor, obviously, you're spending a good bit of time in Republican leadership. In times like these, what do we need to do as a country? Does the Republican Party have a responsibility to be seen as a willing partner with the President of the United States?
I don't think there's any question that when we saw the unfolding of the horror and the terror on the streets of Paris last week, that this sent shockwaves through the communities across America, and people are scared. And I do think that, yes, the parties need to work together. And that's why when we see the President talk like he just did, it really does rile up some people to say, hey, wait a minute, what we're doing is not working. We're scared. Mika, you talk about the governors and their reaction. What we need is a plan. And as you said, I've endorsed Jeb Bush since the summertime. And when he gave a speech at the Reagan Library, he said, we need a plan not only to rebuild our military, but in order to do that, in order to keep America safe. That's why we need to do
Jeb
that.
Bush yesterday morning, talking to Bloomberg, said that we have a tradition of accepting refugees into this country, and we need to continue that tradition. It sounded as if he, too, is disagreeing with most of the Republican governors.
So I think where Jeb has come down on this is say, first and foremost, we've got to keep our country safe. And the visceral reaction, we've seen that occur. But Jeb has also said we've got to be sure that our vetting process is something that actually works.
So we have one, first of all, correct?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so we're at least having a conversation where we all agree that there is one.
We have a vetting process.
I have it here.
It is not as complete as other vetting processes because it is hard to go back and get information from the state of Syria on the people who want to come to this country.
Well, that is usually the case that you are dealing with when you're dealing with refugees and people who are persecuted and running from their homeland. We don't have a database to work with, which is why we have an extensive vetting process that lasts over 18 months for these families, where they are given physical tests, they are interviewed multiple times, health exams. Why don't you all look at the vetting process and tell me what is wrong with it?
Is the vetting process good enough to accept 10,000 Syrian refugees as the president wants over the next year?
We have a thorough and detailed vetting process, and actually later today there's going to be a bipartisan classified briefing for the Senate, so we all are working from the same common set of facts.
So should we continue with the president's plan to accept 10,000 Syrian refugees over the next year?
We should be working first to make sure that the vetting process is as thorough and secure as we are told it is.
Right.
We should reassure ourselves that it actually is as secure as we understand it to be. And we should move forward to continue accepting refugees that have been thoroughly vetted and pose no risk to the United States.
So can you give me an answer today on the 10,000 Syrian refugees the president wants to bring in?
I think we first have to assess the thoroughness and security of the vetting process.
Richard Haas.
On a bipartisan basis.
Joe, we need a vetting process that's good and can handle scale, but that's not enough. We also need a policy of integration, that once people who are vetted are let in, that they are integrated as fully as they can within that society. And then we need a monitoring policy. And this gets into this whole area of NSA and the issue of private security versus collective security. And what, if any, ways we need to adjust that balance. So I don't think it's enough to put all the burden on vetting. My view is we do need to let these people, and it's not simply consistent with our DNA, but it's consistent with American security. People are worried about the downside to security if a few bad people get in. I'm worried about the downside to security if the United States alienates many of the Muslims already in this country or other Muslims around the world if we erect a barrier to Muslim immigration. So to me, the answer is yes, vetting, but then also integrating and monitoring as need be. You need a total policy.
And Eric, that's what the United States does, so much better than Europe. We do know how to integrate so much better than Paris.
This raises the question of the other controversial issue, which is the metadata collection program, because Richard talked about the need for us to make sure that we're safe once we let folks in. But, you know, Congress went about taking away a lot of those tools, and this is something that, you know, Jeb Bush has been talking about, saying, hey, I've said all along we shouldn't be giving up the metadata collection tools that our law enforcement and agencies have to make sure that we are safe, to watch the potential for homegrown terrorist organizations here at home. And that, I think, also has to be a part of this discussion.
Okay, we do understand that we're talking about this after a terror attack in Paris in which the attackers were French and Belgian. They were not refugees, correct?
Well, I don't know if all that has been. I don't know if all that has been definitively determined.
But largely so, yes. Yeah.
Largely so.
But that reinforces the need then to have a surveillance program, a way of monitoring wherever the people have come from, wherever they visited. We do have to have enough of a mechanism in our society to make sure that the people who are here, however they got here, are playing by the rules and keeping the laws.
Richard Haass, thank you. Senator Chris Coons, thank you very much. Thomas Sanderson and former Majority Leader Eric Cantor, thank you as well. And still ahead, the latest information from the ground in Paris following the police raid on a terror cell which left 2 dead and 7 under arrest. Stay with us.
All right, well, let's bring in right now from Capitol Hill Congressman Keith Ellison of Minnesota. Congressman, a great day to have you on here to talk about a variety of issues we've been discussing this morning. First of all, why don't you help us forward with inside the Muslim community? What is, because Muslims in America are obviously just as concerned as Christians or Jews or anybody else in America keeping their neighborhoods safe. So what is a good balance between allowing Syrian refugees into this country, but also maintaining the security that you want in your neighborhood as much as I want in mine?
Well, I think we have a process that takes about 18 months to 2 years. There's multiple screenings and interviews that go on, multiple databases that are applied. I think we already have a pretty lengthy process. And by the way, we have a good track record. My own district, I'm proud to say, has many excellent people who are from Somalia. They come from a war-torn area. They come from an area where there's a terrorist group called Al-Shabaab. And yet our Homeland Security process, vetting process, has been pretty successful, and you know, people are doing well. So I think that we should not alter who we are and what we do based on what Daesh is trying to do. We should bolster our process. We should improve it as we go. But I don't think that we should signal to Daesh or anyone that we're going to set up a whole new set of rules to vet people who are Muslim. I think we should treat people the same.
Congressman Ellison, this is Michael Steele. With respect to that point and what Joe and the table was just talking about, in looking at the American process, clearly there is a level of confidence. You just talked about an 18 to 24-month process for migrants to come here. What about the European process? What role or what advice, what process can you, as a member of Congress, bring to bear in that conversation so that we know and give the governors of the country the confidence that it is complete and whole from beginning to end?
I think we need to embrace our European neighbors and help them bolster their process. I think we need to recognize that we're kind of all in this together, that Daesh hates the world, including the Muslim world, by the way, and we have to join together with our European neighbors and others as well to make sure that we keep the Daesh terrorists on one side and the fleeing refugees who are fleeing those terrorists on the other, who need a safe haven. And this, you know, we need to really have a comprehensive look here. You know, one thing I'll tell you, Michael, is I'm very happy that in Vienna last week, world leaders, regional leaders, including Putin and Obama, really began to start talking about ending the conflict with, you know, diplomatic means and, of course, law enforcement and military means. At the end of the day, we can talk about refugees, and we should, but we got to end this conflict. We have to stop the pot from boiling from the very beginning, and that's where I'd like to spend a lot of time focusing attention.
Congressman Ellison, Margaret Carlson here. Since the Paris attacks, as you go about your business on the Hill and you hear your colleagues saying we'll accept Christians, possibly, but not Muslims, what do you say to them? And, well, first of all, how does that make you feel? I mean, you're a protected class as a congressman, but as a Muslim. And what do you say to them to try to walk that back?
I say Congress shall make no law establishing a religion nor the free exercise thereof. That is the first clause of the First Amendment. I'm telling you that, these folks are letting fear make them forget our Constitution, and they shouldn't do it. I mean, the fact of the matter is that we don't do that. That's not who we are as a nation. Also, tactically, it's a big mistake because remember, Daesh, their primary argument is that the West is at war with Islam and Islam is at war with the West. If we start saying Christians but no Muslims, aren't we reinforcing their narrative? No, we have to say they're not representing anything but totalitarian, murderous extremism, and we represent civilization, civility, tolerance, inclusion. That's who we are, and that's who they are, and we should never forget that. And we should always remember that
Congressman Ellison, David Ignatius from the Washington Post. I just wanted to ask you what you're hearing from Muslim Americans, whether they are feeling that they're under attack, whether when they hear these governors talk about keeping out Muslims, keeping out Syrians, they feel personally upset, because if they begin to get angry, it becomes a very different situation. What are you hearing?
What I'm hearing is that people feel fear, trepidation, hurt feelings. But you know what mostly the prevalent feeling is? A surge of patriotism. It's like, wait a minute, I'm an American too. This is my country too. I'm here because I love this country and I will fight for it, I'll die for it. And I'm not going to let ISIS ruin things for Muslims around the world. And I'm feeling a resurgence and a need to really kind of assert a Muslim Americanness and tolerance and inclusion and respect. So I mean, that's kind of the weird thing, as some folks who of other faiths fear Muslims are saying they're trying to assert their belonging in this society. And look, my constituency in the 5th District of Minnesota is mostly not Muslim, right? They know I'm Muslim. And we've seen people all over this country voting more, participating more, volunteering more, and I just think that we need to continue on that trend. The truth is, the Japanese Americans fought most valiantly in World War II. You know that, right? I mean, it's a fact that people who sometimes have their loyalty questioned become the most patriotic in loyalty. And I believe that's what's going on now. Although people do feel some people feel kind of bad. Some parents feel a little worried for their kids.
All right, Congressman Keith Ellison, thank you so much for being with us.
45 past the hour. France is seeking to up the ante on ISIS with yet another wave of airstrikes. The latest round has targeted Raqqa, the Islamic State's de facto center of operations. The Wall Street Journal reports earlier in the day French jet fighters dropped 16 bombs on 2 targets, a command center and a training center. Also yesterday, European officials unanimously backed a French request for support with military missions, and President Francois Hollande is set to meet with both American and Russian counterparts next week to broaden the coalition. Joining us now, member of the Armed Services and Foreign Affairs Committee, Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard of Hawaii. She was deployed to Iraq twice as part of the Hawaiian National Guard. Also with us, Republican Congressman Adam Kinzinger of Illinois, who served in the Air Force in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And NBC News Justice correspondent Pete Williams is at the table as well. Good to have you all.
Congresswoman, let's start with you. You had some pretty tough words about the illegal war against Assad. You said we must stop the illegal war against Assad. Explain.
Well, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding and confusion. A lot of people, frankly, just aren't aware that there are 2 wars that we're waging right now in Syria. The first one is against ISIS. This is a war that was authorized after 9/11 against al-Qaeda and its affiliates, these other Islamic extremist groups, and this is a war that is within our national security interests. The second war is the war to overthrow the Syrian government of Assad. This is not a war that has been authorized by Congress. Congress has not declared war against this sovereign government, and it's counterproductive to our first war to defeat our enemy, because it's helping achieve the objective that ISIS, Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra, and all these other Islamic extremist groups are trying to do, to take over all of Syria, to establish their Islamic caliphate, which would be disastrous in a humanitarian perspective and also a greater threat to the world.
But Congressman, can we have peace in Syria if Assad stays?
No, and I mean, you know, with respect to my friend Tulsi, the idea of an illegal war against a dictator that his country's turning against, he controls 18% of Syria.
Well, shouldn't we declare war against Assad?
No, because we're not engaged in active warfare. Are we maybe helping to train the opposition? Sure, we do that in a lot of places. It's active warfare is, you know, we're airstrikes against him. We dealt with that with the Red Line, which we made a huge mistake in not enforcing against Assad. But look, when all is said and done, if you want to fix ISIS, you have to fix Syria. Assad controls 18% of it. As long as he stays, there's no chance for hope in Syria, and these groups rebel.
Richard Haas, isn't that part of the problem, though, is that it is a two-front war, and we're not exactly sure where we stand against Assad being driven out of power, and where we stand on how aggressive we're going to be against ISIS.
Exactly right. We want Assad driven out of power, but not quite so quickly that there's a vacuum of power, so that we could see in Damascus a version of what we saw in Lebanon. That said, he does have to leave power, but it's not going to be through an American act of war. That seems to me almost irrelevant. The only way he's going to be driven out of power is if his Alawite colleagues and the Iranians and the Russians want him pushed out of power. Those are the people keeping him there. So it doesn't require an act of war to see political change and transition in Damascus. The problem is that his many backers show precious little inclination to push him out. There is the larger question: how do we conduct a war in Syria under these circumstances? Because odds are, Joe, for the next couple of years, Assad could well be in power in an enclave that controls a fraction of the country. How is it we support Kurds? How is it we support the various Arab tribes? How do we go after ISIS and Nusra in that environment? What is our goal? What scale do we do it with? What role do others play? What's our definition of success? How fast do we try to achieve how much? And is that in any way necessarily supported by an act of war? That's the question about American strategy that I simply do not see being debated in this country.
And Pete Williams, we also obviously going to have another debate in this country, and that is where security concerns meet personal liberty. We had the battle after September 11th. We're going to have it again now, looking at some of these apps that are encrypted. What do you expect the debate to look like in the coming months?
It's been a sort of an evolution on this. You know, the FBI has been warning about this since May, about the possibility that terrorist suspects are using these apps that you can download and put on your smartphone that provide what they call end-to-end encryption. You send a text message, it's encrypted from the moment it leaves your cell phone until it's received and read by the party you sent it to. And in the meantime, if the FBI comes and knocks on the door and says to WhatsApp or Threema or Telegram or any of these apps, hey, we have a court order here, we need to read what Joe is sending, that company can't do anything because it's encrypted. It can't even read it. Now, initially, the FBI director has sounded a big alarm on this. He seemed to get some traction. The companies have been pushing back a little bit, but the administration has sort of backed off of a confrontational approach. It doesn't look like there's going to be any legislation right now. The administration isn't pushing it. So now what you hear from the Homeland Security Secretary and the FBI director is, well, we're trying to talk to the companies. We're trying to work this out. We think that the atmosphere is better than when James Comey initially said, I have a huge problem with Apple's phones that even Apple can't unlock if you lock them. So I think the Paris attacks, though, do shift the pendulum some, and perhaps it's moving a little away from protecting privacy at all costs to look now at maybe there is some way to meet in the middle ground. I just want to say one other thing here. Sure. What the companies say is they don't want to provide a quote-unquote back door that shows the government this is all you have to do to get in. a compromise might be fine. Don't give it to the government. You keep it yourself if you're the app developer, and we won't use it until we have a court order, and then you give us the content. That may be a compromise.
I think Congress is going to jump into this because the administration didn't get anywhere. Congressional committees now want action. The intelligence committees are going to jump into this because they see a real problem.
Dianne Feinstein told yesterday Congressman basically to get lost. She went to her own constituents in Silicon Valley saying, I need help.
Yeah.
We need help. Is Congress going to have to step forward?
Yeah, but it's going to take private sector involvement. I mean, when we even tried to deal with this idea of private sector sharing virus threats or sharing, internet threats with the government voluntarily, not forced, I mean, these privacy groups exploded, and it became a huge political hot potato. The idea that we can now get to the point where we're going to be allowed to read encrypted text messages, I think it's going to be a big fight. It's a discussion we're going to have, though.
It's going to be a big fight because it's always that argument of the balance between civil liberties and national security. And I think the key to this is something that you mentioned is with cause. If you have a court order, if you have a valid reason to be able to try to get access to the information, that's one thing, versus the bulk gathering, the gathering of information on all Americans, whether it's emails or phone calls or who we're calling. That's, I think, at the crux of this argument is with cause versus gathering information on all Americans.
Important to note here, though, that while we're having this discussion, we don't yet know if, in fact, the plotters in Paris used encrypted apps. We just don't know that yet. Many law enforcement people have said they think it's likely, but we don't know it. These are people that there were brothers involved in this. They knew each other, so maybe they did the planning over the kitchen table. We just don't know that yet.
All right, Tulsa Gabbard, Adam Kinzinger, and Pete Williams, thank you very much. As we go to break, this just in from the Associated Press, the main terminal at Copenhagen's International Airport has been evacuated because of a suspicious bag. We'll be tracking that development and the latest from the raid in Saint Denis, when Morning Joe comes right back. 33 past the hour. We have an update on that violent anti-terror raid in a neighborhood just north of Paris this morning. The French Interior Minister just addressed reporters and said that 7 have been arrested. 2 suspects are dead. They are not identifying who was arrested at this time, but confirmed that they believed the so-called linchpin of last week's deadly attacks, Abdelhamid Aboud, would be found inside the apartment. They are currently not answering questions of whether he was inside. We are awaiting an address from President Hollande. Let's go. Monitoring a news conference in Paris right now. The French Interior Minister is speaking, and we're following that. Right now, though, the president is in Manila, the capital of the Philippines, and Josh Earnest joins us right now. Josh, I don't know if you've been able to catch part of our conversation, but first question to you, is the president and the administration underestimating the level of the threat and really the reaction to what is happening in Paris and around the world right now?
Well, good morning, guys. I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to be on the show, even from Manila here. Look, the president has been very focused on some important business here in Asia, but that has not come second in any way to making sure that our country is doing what is necessary to respond to this significant threat from ISIL. The fact is, the president has laid out a strategy that's more than a year old now for degrading and ultimately destroying that terrorist organization. And we have seen stepped up attacks from both the French and the Russians overnight. We obviously welcome those actions that are focused against ISIL. The French for some time have been a part of this 65-member coalition that the president built and has been leading, and we certainly welcome their stepped-up contributions. When it comes to the Russians, we welcome the change in strategy that they're at least starting to signal, based on finally now starting to focus on ISIL targets and not spending so much time focused on shoring up Bashar al-Assad, who has essentially been their client, who's been losing his grip on power over the last several years.
Josh, over the weekend, the White House stated after these attacks that it was unlikely that ISIS had the capabilities to strike in the same way inside the United States that they struck in Paris last Friday night. Is that still the White House's position today?
Well, Joe, there's no denying that that Europe faces a larger risk when it comes to extremists and when it comes to ISIL than the United States does. That said, the president certainly doesn't take lightly the risk that does exist. And that's why when the president convened a national security meeting of his national security team on Saturday, prior to leaving on this trip, the president met with his Secretary of Homeland Security. He met with his director of the FBI. He met with his Attorney General, who all of whom participated in that meeting. And the president's first question to the people around that table was, have we taken the steps that we believe are necessary to both prevent attacks in the United States and follow up on ongoing investigations to ensure that we are keeping tabs on those who need to be worried about and making sure that we're taking all the steps that are necessary to protect the homeland. This is certainly a priority of the President of the United States.
David Ignatius.
Josh, I wanted to ask you specifically what new steps the White House has authorized for the U.S. to take to assist France in intelligence cooperation, other law enforcement efforts, and also what new kinds of military action is the White House contemplating in the wake of these events?
Well, David, as the president announced at his news conference at the G20, the United States and France have been for some time working to deepen our military and intelligence cooperation when it comes to Syria. And we have done that, and we followed through on that. And it is because of that cooperation and because of the kind of logistical support that only the United States can provide that France is actually even in a position to ramp up the strikes that they took in Raqqa overnight. So we're seeing the fruits of this early investment based on France carrying out these actions. I think what is also true and what you've also seen is seeing the United States use all of our law enforcement and intelligence resources to assist the French as they carry out their investigation and even conduct some of the law enforcement activities that they've been engaged in over the last several days, including the significant events overnight. So
Josh,
we are committed to being sure that we are standing shoulder to shoulder with our oldest ally as they confront this threat on their own soil.
Josh, just to be clear what you mean with what you just said, does that mean that we are providing targeting information to the French so that they can strike ISIS targets in Syria?
That is precisely the kind of information that the United States can provide. And, David, the only reason that the United States is in a position to do that is more than a year ago, the president ordered significant military operations inside of Syria that are being carried out by the United States and our coalition partners. So the intelligence that we've gleaned over the last year, the military strikes that the United States and our coalition partners have already taken over the last year, have laid the groundwork and created an opportunity for France to step up and make their own contribution to our broader coalition. We obviously welcome their ramped-up contribution, but there should be no denying the fact that the only reason that the French are in a position to carry out this kind of response is because of the early investment in our military and in our intelligence that the president ordered more than a year ago.
John Eilman.
Josh, the debate over refugees in the United States has obviously become very intense and very politicized very, very quickly. The president on Wednesday in the Philippines, where you are, attacked Republicans in a pretty sharp way. There are those who would say that Republicans have also amped up their criticism of the president, but do you take the point of those who think that it's incumbent on the president to try to rise above that politicization and try to call for unity rather than more partisan attacks?
Well, John, the fact of the matter is this rhetoric that we see from Republican candidates for president and even some from Republican members of Congress who are offering up legislation suggesting that somehow we should put a halt to our refugee program. The fact of the matter is legislation like that is much more focused on politics than it is national security. And so if you want the commander-in-chief and the president of the United States to be focused on doing what's in the national security interest of the United States, the president believes clearly that rhetoric, like we're seeing from the Republican side, only serves the ISIL argument, that they are leading a war of Islam against the West. The fact of the matter is the West is not at war with Islam. And this is a point that President Obama's predecessor, George W. Bush, made on a number of occasions. And for Republicans to erode that progress and erode that effort and undermine that message only serves to advance the argument of ISIL. So the president standing up and speaking out about this does serve our national security interest and does make clear that their political arguments are not good for our national security. And the president's not going to hesitate to make that point, regardless of who makes it.
All right, Josh Ernest, thank you so much.
Josh.
Greatly appreciate you taking time to talk to us from Manila.
The number of states saying no to Middle East refugees is growing. This morning, governors in 31 states say they are opposing, refusing, or suspending the resettlement of Syrian refugees into their state. White House officials called dozens of governors on Tuesday to discuss the refugee program, and President Obama, traveling in the Philippines, visibly irritated.
These are the same folks oftentimes who suggest that they're so tough that just talking to Putin or staring down ISIL or using some additional rhetoric somehow is going to solve the problems out there. But apparently they're scared of widows and orphans coming into the United States of America as part of our tradition of compassion. Now, first they were worried about the press being too tough on them during debates. Now they're worried about 3-year-old orphans. That doesn't sound very tough to me.
Meanwhile, Congress now taking action, seeming to support governors opposed to refugees. Tomorrow, the House is expected to vote on legislation aimed at strengthening the oversight of Syrian and Iraqi refugees hoping to come to the United States. With me now from Capitol Hill, California Democratic Congressman Brad Sherman, a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Congressman, it's a pleasure to see you, sir.
Good to be with you.
Before we get to the matter over refugees, what can you tell us about the private briefing you received yesterday from the FBI and DHS regarding these attacks?
Well, the briefing was mostly about the refugees and the security of the homeland, and I think they were convincing that those who are admitted as refugees to the United States get far more scrutiny and vetting than those who enter the United States, and tens of millions of people do every year as tourists, business people, etc. These are the most vetted visas that we issue. For example, these same governors who are walling off from highly vetted refugees have offices in Europe trying to attract European tourists. Well, almost everyone who was killing folks in Paris had a European passport. And now these governors are showing them pictures of iconic tourist attractions in their state. No one wants to wall the United States off from European tourists. Nobody's walling us off from Saudi businessmen and investors. The focus here is on a few hundred refugees. Terrorists can terrorize, and they can make you a little crazy, make you a little emotional. We have to worry about all the threats, and this may be the smallest of the threats we face.
Yeah, and Congressman, you did say almost all of the terrorists had European passports, but maybe one didn't. And the question is, how is the United States vetting differently from countries, for example, in the European Union? And is there a difference?
Oh, well, you see that law and order has broken down. You have people walking by the thousands through European countries. That's not a 2-hour vetting process before they get into a particular country. We have a 2-year vetting process. So while Europe is opening its doors and we admire their generosity, it is so different from the United States process.
Congressman Brad Sherman, thank you for your time this morning. I so appreciate it.
It was fairly extraordinary. The president overseas, in the middle of this international crisis, making jokes about Republican debate moderators and 3-year-old orphans. I just, maybe we're in a new territory. Maybe I'm cynical because I've been a member of Congress, but I always expect certain members of Congress to, quote, pop off and say really stupid things. I don't expect the commander-in-chief, and I say that as one who was there and popped off and said stupid things. I don't expect the commander-in-chief to do this.
You don't, particularly on foreign soil, particularly in the midst of a global crisis, and particularly, I think, to get into the muck and mire of politics. I mean, I think that's the most astounding part of it. I get wanting to respond to what Republicans may or may not be saying, but there is a certain, I think, requirement of the White House at this point to rise above it, and I think that was the point that you were making earlier, that This is a time where you need to be clear and definite in what you want to say, and not political. And you know, one of the questions I would ask Josh is, what is exactly the tone coming out of this White House? What is the thinking that someone is advising the president
I don't think
before or
anybody's
after?
advising the president.
Well, yeah, maybe that's just it. No one's talking to us. Do you know how this sounds when you're out here saying these things the way you're saying?
On the world stage.
It's fairly remarkable, and Mika and I were talking about this yesterday after the show. It reminded us of what happened with the BP oil spill, and us going and talking to the White House repeatedly, saying, we know this area, and the president was just so tone deaf, and he went to a long Memorial Day week, and they just didn't seem to get it. An oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico is one thing, but you're right, taking partisan shots overseas at governors sitting at 2% in national polls does not seem to be what the president should be busying himself.
Well, it's also risen up to the Speaker of the House.
There are a lot but the Speaker of the House, though, didn't say anything personal. He talked about a policy, though, that Chuck Schumer right now is debating, and other Democrats,
Hillary Clinton,
and Hillary Clinton,
we should take a pause,
and other people are doing it. I'm just talking about the quote popping off from the commander-in-chief.
There have been Republican presidential candidates of all kinds who have taken very direct shots at President Obama. They say he doesn't believe in American leadership, et cetera. They're playing the game pretty rough. The president is still the president of the United States. He has a kind of moral stature. He is the leader of the entire country, and in some sense the leader of the free world. There's no reason why the president could not say, look, we have an important and what I think is counterproductive debate going on refugees. I will engage with that debate when I get back home.
Yeah.
I have points that I will make, but I'm going to defer doing that right now in order to stay focused on the task at hand right now, which is uniting the world. And I think that would serve the stature of the office better. He can make his political arguments a few days from now when he gets back home. I know he wants to respond to his critics, but that would be a better posture.
To put it into context, he was asked. So it's not like he just sort of jumped up there and sort of going after low-level governors.
Right, history's going to have to answer the question of why. Every elite we know in both parties will privately say, and some publicly, it's just not the best tone to have right now. Why is he doing it?
Agree.
Is he doing it out of emotion? Is he doing it because he thinks it's the better for the country? Because most people don't think it's
Richard
better for
Haas. Everybody we've spoken to over the past 24 hours have been stunned. David wants to get in, but Richard Haas, let's go to you first.
Go ahead, on the basic strategy, I think it would be very helpful if the president or the White House essentially articulated what they think is a reasonable, doable strategy of victory right now. What is, for example, the rate at which we want to reduce the territory held by ISIS in Syria and Iraq? Then they could talk about what kind of a plan do we think we need to do to bring that about, how many forces, what the United States would be prepared to do in conjunction, in part of a coalition of the willing, so to speak, with other parties, the French, the British, several Arab elements. Then we can begin to have a strategy. We simply don't have one, and I don't understand what is our definition of near-term victory or success here. And unless you have that, it's very hard to conduct any sort of an operation. And that is what is missing. The president was complaining the other day that he wasn't getting credit for the strategy he had put out there, and claiming his critics were really offering nothing new. And I just don't think that's right. We don't have a fully developed strategy out there, and people are suggesting we should be doing more in order to bring about a different strategy.
I've yet to talk, speaking of elites on both sides, I've yet to talk to an elite foreign policy analyst that thinks we do have a coherent strategy in Syria. David Ignatius.
I wanted to make one point about the president's comments. I think that what the president is doing at a time when governors are saying no Syrian immigrants, no Muslim Syrian immigrants. The president is standing up for what he thinks of as America's traditional moral stature and values. Those comments are disturbing to a lot of us. There is a vetting procedure in place that governors should know about. It's understandable that governors want to be sure their states are safe. Right. But to make announcements at a time like this that we don't want any Muslims, that really is like throwing a match into kerosene. That speaks directly to the narrative of these people who want to kill Americans.
I think we all agree with that around the table. We're talking about the president's. Is there not a better way to do that than saying these Republicans are scared of debate moderators and 3-year-old orphans?
You know, there's always room to correct people's language, but I think we need to understand the point.
David, are you saying to me today that the president has been tonally on point over the past 48 hours?
Well, I would say by comparison to Republican governors who are making these comments.
But we have one commander-in-chief at a time of international crisis.
You know, you have to figure out what your principal focus of outrage is, and I think the comments from the governors really hurt our country.
It was ugly.
Right.
It was ugly.
Can I just back? I mean, as someone who's actually served as an elected statewide official, as lieutenant governor of my state, I remember those security briefings and what that means, and understand very much where these governors are coming from. And no one seems to appreciate what they have to deal with, because when Governor Markell of Delaware was asked yesterday on hardball, are you ready to take responsibility if one of these migrants come in and something happens? Are you ready to take responsibility for that? He stumbled and he stuttered over the answer, and that's the point the governors have to deal with, because who's going to ultimately be responsible if something happens?
And again, you have Jeanne Shaheen, you have Hillary Clinton, it's not just Republicans now concerned. We have a lot to get to.
But they shouldn't come on the show and lie about whether or not there's a vetting process. I mean, we need to have a real conversation, and these governors have been, I think, to the point of I think kind of ugly.
Still ahead of Morning Joe.
Lowered the level of the conversation.
Still ahead of Morning Joe. Much more on the volatile situation playing out in Paris. French officials gave an update just moments ago, and we're going to bring you the very latest from the ground in France.
And tomorrow we have an exclusive interview from the Pentagon with Defense Secretary Ashton Carter. It will be his first interview